We've gone international this week. Get out your beer, pretzels, dirndls, oompa music, and knee-slapping good times. Let's polka! Oh, I've read this room wrong. We're here for murder. Or rather, I should say murders. Lots of murders. And disclaimer, this is a doozy. This is a bit uncomfortable, more than normal. It's July 1924 in Hanover, Germany. A man dubbed the human vampire, Fritz Harrmann, is in police custody. He's about 45 with thin hair, a broad flat nose, deep set and thick-browed eyes, protruding chin, and a wolf-like mouth. What on earth? He's a meat vendor working at a butcher shop. He lives at 2 Rote Reihe, which translates to Red Row, which is unfortunately fitting. So what did Fritz Harrmann do? He prowled the streets for boys and young men, luring them to his place on the river Lina, on the promise of tea cakes. He also allegedly got these boys for his fashionable acquaintances to treat them with wine and opera and big times in luxury. He procured enough money from these acquaintances for him to live comfortably and to look the part. And thanks to these acquaintances who happened to perhaps be lining the pockets of the police, Harrmann flew under the radar for longer than he should have. We're in post-World War I times, with returning soldiers coming home to a meat shortage, food lines everywhere, crowded markets, women with empty baskets searching for anything to buy for what will no doubt be an inflated price. Fritz saw what food there was being secreted off to the rich, the black market doing very well. He gets hints that becoming a butcher would be lucrative. Who cares what kind of meat it is? People are desperate, he hears. Horses, dogs, steal a pig from a farm and make some dough. Fritz takes the advice and does well despite inflation. He allegedly also ingratiates himself with local authorities and becomes a spy. Communism was seen as the Red Menace. He was told to look out for Reds. But then he came upon his first victim, a 17-year-old boy who had run away from home and fell into the influence of Fritz, who gave him a necktie and other gifts, showed him a good time with alcohol and doped cigarettes. But the boy was never seen again. And things would become worse with the growing population around the local rail station of homeless soldiers and vagabond boys. Not all of them were nameless. Some had family looking for them and never finding them. By 1921, Hanover was secretly being called the Port of Missing Men. And the worst thing that could happen, happened. Fritz was actually given a badge and became a part of the Hanover police force, having gained such a reputation for his political spying prowess. He patrolled the rail station, stealing from the poor, arresting people, or offering his home as a place to stay, from which they would never emerge. 1923, he would come about one Hans Granz, who was a professional gigolo and entertainer, about 20 or so years old, and Fritz would invite Hans to share his lodging. And Hans didn't die. Apparently they were too like-minded. Money was flowing. Fritz and Hans would move to the Red Row in the attic right on the Lina River, where bucket loads of bones and other stuff would be dumped into the river. No one thought anything of it, if they even saw anything. He's a butcher after all. And Hans would be seen pawning clothes. No biggie. The economy being what it is, people had to make some moolah however they could. But then some kids looking for stuff in May, as kids do, on the riverbank, found a skull. And then the next week, another skull was found. People weren't as alarmed as you think they could be. It had flooded that spring in one of the local cemeteries. So perhaps this was some overflow? But then in June, a boatman brought up a sack of ribs and shin bones, and soon there would be some 500 various human bones found. Some of the skulls were identified thanks to dental work, measurements taken, and then police realized that they had done a very bad thing in hiring Fritz. The arresting officer said to Fritz, quote, "You are wanted at headquarters, Fritz. By the way, where did you get that keychain you're wearing? It resembles one owned by Heinrich Struss, a young student who had disappeared here last August. You are under arrest for murder." End quote. Hans was found wearing the gray pants of a missing person, and the jig was up. The attic penthouse was searched, and pawn tickets were found, along with the clothes of missing boys and men, a blood-soaked mattress, and a cleaver. Confronted, the two blamed each other. The number of true murders will never be known. Fritz guessed maybe 30 or 40. Hans would say that Fritz was the one that did the killing. He just held them. The investigation was fraught with issues, to the point that there are 5 sets of investigators, 3 sets investigating the actual murders, 2 sets investigating the investigators. That's a bad sign already. Police officials in the area have been accused of negligence and incompetence, and even at their own request are being looked into by the state prosecutor. Mass protests are occurring, angered by the seemingly worthless investigating. July 18th. Young men are committing suicide, fearing their connection to Fritz will be exposed through the confessions that are coming out. The depraved behavior of these young men is apparently unprintable. A news correspondent looking at Harmann's domicile found something unseen by the police. A sign with the initial MWH hung over a pantry-like opening where Fritz allegedly kept his victims before cutting them up. The sign, in addition to the initials, had skull and crossbones on it. Per Fritz, quote, "I committed all the murders in moments of insensate ecstasy. As soon as they made their last gasp, I invariably fell into a death-like sleep. When I awoke, I found the body beside me and realized what I had done. Sometimes I was still so tired that I just pushed the body off the bed and dropped off to sleep again. Later, when I was fully awake, I simply had to remove the evidence. Oh, I tell you, it was not easy. It was terrible." And because killers like to think well of themselves, quote, "But I did a good job each time, didn't I? You see, I am not a scientifically trained, but I think many famous professors of anatomy could learn something from me." End quote. He says he didn't sell the victim's flesh, but police think he did. As of this date, he says that he has killed 22. He refuses to confess to more than what the police have proof of. The police have found 192 leg bones, 66 ribs, 45 arm and hand bones. Most of them have been found in the river. In his room, they found a huge bag of quicklime and lots of pots and pans. While investigating, a woman brought in meat, saying it was strange, and she suspected that it was human flesh. Thankfully, no, it was pork, but the investigators would say, quote, "Every day we get dozens of inquiries like this. Every bit is carefully analyzed, but so far we have no conclusive proof. We know Harmon sold meat at ridiculously low prices, even 4 years ago when all meat was rationed. Most of the meat we traced so far was horse, dog, cat, or goat meat." End quote. July 21st. As of now, Fritz has been charged with 17 murders with a possible 8 more. 8 police officials have been dismissed from their duties, allegedly because they were a part of these so-called parties. Dr. Kopp, criminologist with the Ministry of the Interior, said that Harmon is, quote, "unquestionably, strangely psychopathic and presents a bewildering combination of unnatural impulses." End quote. Fritz claims that he was not conscious when he did the murders. Those who were murdered were said to be so-called floaters, who were happy to have a night's lodging or a drink, which Harmon drugged, and while they were asleep, Harmon would strangle them, among other things. November 13th. Fritz is now officially charged with 27 murders of young men and boys and will go on trial in December. Hans Granz is still said to be an accomplice of Fritz's and has been charged with at least 2 of the cases. Police feel there must be more. Also, they are still not able to definitely prove that Fritz sold the flesh of his victims as meat. December 6th. We're at trial. Fritz is trying to impress upon the court that Hans Granz was the one nagging him to get victims and to dispose of them quickly. According to Fritz, Quote, "Don't keep him too long," Grounds would say when he brought a new youth to the slaughter, Harmon testified. "We must have his clothes." The next morning, Harmon continued. Grounds would come while Harmon was dismembering the body, and his first question would be, "Where are the clothes?" Harmon swore he begged Grounds to keep him from repeating these killings. Quote, "Don't let me get in that awful kind of fix again," end quote, he said he told his accomplice. He declared that he had sometimes withstood the appeals of his partner in their ghoulish trade. Quote, "If I had killed all whom Grounds brought me, I could not count them today. They would be so many," end quote, he said. This is according to the Washington Times, December 6, 1924. Judge ain't appreciating all the ladies who are trying to attend court in the midst of the horrific testimony. Professors of pathology are also attending, taking an interest in the oddity that is Fritz. A box of bones from the river was placed in front of Fritz at the trial today. It was said he viewed it calmly. The bones are going to start to be identified as best as they could back in those times. December 6th. Some 285 bones were brought into court. Skulls were held up, one by one, in front of Fritz, who denied they belonged to boys or men who he lured to his home. Quote, "I smashed their skulls in and sawed their bodies to pieces after cutting their throats. I smashed them pretty fine. There was only one that I threw into the river whole," end quote. Grounds apparently found victims for Fritz based on how nicely they were dressed. The nicer, the better. Plus preferably between the ages of 15 and 18. After the murder, Grounds would sell the clothes. Murder number 24. Grounds allegedly wanted this one dead because, as Harmon said, quote, "because they must have the victim's good new suit," end quote. He was kept in the house 5 days, which Hans didn't like. Quote, "Hans advised against this because it was expensive having him around for 5 days, Harmon said. "Finally, on the 6th day, I killed him. While I was chopping up the corpse, Hans stuck his head in the door and asked, 'Where is his suit?' Harmon insisted that Grounds and another man named Witowski procured most of his victims for him. Grounds would deny this. Apparently, one of the victims was only 10. Harmon said this one was killed by Grounds and Witowski because Harmon only killed them between the ages of 15 and 18. Murder number 14. He said he didn't kill this one, that Witowski and Grounds tried to argue him into the belief that he had done the murder. Quote, "If I had, I would have done it by biting his throat as I did the others." End quote. Good point. Police testimony actually seems to lean on the allegations that Grounds was really the evil one. Fritz was just a tool in his hands. Fritz's former landlady, Frau Seemann, testified that 6 years ago she heard sounds of hacking from his room, and later he gave her bones with flesh on them to be used in a stew. She said that the flesh looked oddly white after boiling and made her feel ill after she ate it. Scientists reviewing some of the bottles of human flesh that were sitting in the court, they said they couldn't tell if it was human or not. Threats against his life were afoot. Some witnesses allegedly saying they will perform their own version of vigilante justice on him if given the chance. A policeman is now standing in front of Fritz while in court. Witnesses will be searched for weapons regardless of gender. December 8th, Atlantic Tri-Weekly Journal, December 11th, 1924. Boys often vanished without a trace, and suspicion centered on Fat Fritz. But although bloodstained clothing was found in Harmon's apartment, no serious step ever was taken against him. He even was permitted to enroll in the voluntary police, and when in 1923 2 women of the streets whom Harmon had sheltered for pay took to the police a human mouth which they found boiling in Harmon's soup kettle, the police commissioner said it might be a pig's snout. Harmon appeared to bear a charmed life. Even when the women testified they saw an apparently dead youth in his bed, he was not charged with homicide. Only last summer, when human skulls and bones and clothing of his victims were discovered in the house, was he arrested. He since has confessed 30 murders, which may be less than half the number he actually committed. Harmon lured boys and youths to his apartment and, according to his own statement, killed them by biting through their Adam's apples and sold their flesh for food. When questioned about packages smelling of raw flesh which he was carrying, he produced police license as a foodstuff dealer. Fritz said, quote, "The first thing to be done was to bite through the Adam's apple. Then the head must be wrapped up in paper because, after all, it continues to stare at one so. Even when the eyes are closed, they do go on staring at you like that, don't they? And then a package was made of the head and set in the corner. Ha ha ha. Why was it? Ha ha ha. That it kept on happening like that over and over again. Often when a skull with empty eye sockets was lying beside me, it seemed as if it was still staring at me. Ha ha ha. Insane? Every murder is more or less insane. No sane person would assume such gigantic risks. End quote. Hans Grand's former girlfriend claimed that Grounds indeed knew all about the murders, that he had told her he was playing Fritz as a tool. She claimed to have seen a 16-year-old boy lying on Fritz's cot. When she asked Fritz about it, he said, "Be quiet, let him sleep." The following day, the boy was gone, but his clothes were still hanging on a nail in the room. December 10th, Frau Engel, another landlady, said that Fritz had sold her as much as 35 pounds of meat weekly. She said it was always the same size, always lean pieces. In addition to meat, she would also purchase clothes from him at good prices. She said she believed it to be horse meat or pork and that it tasted good. Unfortunately, her testimony leaned to some bad feelings against her. She told the court that the mother of one of the murdered yelled at her, "You murderess, you ate my boy." End quote. Engel said that she never saw any bloodstains in the Has house or saw anything suspicious. The building was some 200 years old, but never had rats. Well, not until Fritz moved in. Washington Times, December 10th, 1924. Quote, neighbors testified that attempts to interest police in the hacking noises in Harmon's room were futile. 2 girls testified they saw the body of a boy lying on Harmon's bed with its face to the wall. A youth who was placed on the stand as a witness against Harmon said that Grans, Harmon's alleged accomplice, had tried to persuade him to go with him to Harmon's attic and that he had had a hunch and refused. End quote. Oddly, Fritz found this insulting. Quote, Grants knew my taste, and I'm sure he wouldn't have brought this youth to me. I never took a youth over 20, and this one is at least 24. End quote. Other witnesses were brought in to look at the bones and clothes to try to identify their loved ones. One father identified a skull as being that of his son, the teeth recognizable. So we've already mentioned that he lived at 2 Red Row. Washington Times, December 10th, 1924. Quote, Red Row is one of the darkest quarters of the city. The murder house bears all the earmarks of the scene of dastardly crimes. The ceiling over the rickety, shambling stairs, as well as in the slaughter room itself, is so low one has to keep one's head bowed to avoid getting a sharp bump. There is not a single light in any corridor of the gloomy old building. Only tiny gas flames flicker in the little rooms where tenants, all of whom have been called in as witnesses, talk in whispered tones, recounting what they will say in court. One marvels in talking with these people that Harmon never came under their suspicion. Nobody in the whole house will admit ever having heard or seen the slightest evidence of Harmon's gory deeds. End quote. December 11th. Harmon testified Grand said to him, quote, Fritz, you do these things anyhow. Why don't you get only fellows with the best clothes? Don't take shabby ones. End quote. But Grans denied that he had said that. Harmon said that he told Grans all about the first murder, that Grans saw the body of the second victim and helped him put it in the cupboard to keep Grans' sweetheart from seeing the corpse. Harmon said to the judge, quote, I want you to ask Grans if he knew I killed boys, and if it isn't true that he saw bodies in my room. End quote. But Grans denied it all. Evening Star, December 12th, 1924. Quote, every day of the trial of Fritz Harmon, accused of murdering more than a score of men and boys, brings new and revolting details of this vampire slayer's methods. The courtroom resembles a medical clinic with its exhibits. The parents of some of the murdered boys present a pathetic picture on the witness stand as they are compelled to identify the remnants of clothing and other traces of lost sons. The people are becoming more and more aroused because of alleged police negligence and declining to follow up early reports of missing boys and complaints of neighbors that there was something wrong around Harmon's living quarters. End quote. Murder number 9 was of Richard Graff, age 19, who disappeared October 19, 1923. His mother, remarried Mrs. Drandorf, had been worried that he had been murdered, and Fritz had confessed to the crime. The mother of 3 boys had left Germany for America only a few months before Richard's disappearance, and the boys had continued on in Germany. Richard had intended to head to America, waiting to be admitted to the Germany immigration quota. So one of Richard's brothers is Otto. His fiancée is Anna, who stated, quote, Richard came home one night in October last year. He was worn and tired and hungry. He had tried to go to Switzerland to take a job until he could go to America, but he had to return because he had no passports. He seemed utterly worn out. Otto and I urged him to rest, and I started to make dinner for him, but Richard said he must go to the station where he had met a man who would give him work. That was the last we saw of him. Nearly a year passed when I read of the Harrmann case. We had no clue except that the paper said Harrmann always hovered near the station and lured youths home with him. I urged Otto to go to the police, but he was skeptical. But finally he went and confronted Harrmann, and Harrmann finally admitted he had sold such a suit as Richard had on to the barber. Otto then went to the barber who was wearing Richard's suit. Then he knew Richard was the victim. We couldn't find the heart to write his mother, though she constantly inquired about Richard. Otto would continue, quote, when I confronted Harrmann, I wanted to smash him. I couldn't stand the sight of him. It will be terribly hard in court. Like so many other relatives of victims, I see red when in the presence of that beast, end quote. December 15th. Fritz seems to want to be seen as insane, which, considering what he did, could be plausible. The 17th murder has been denied by Fritz as being done by him. But today, quote, oh, put it down as mine. Put it down, it's all right with me, end quote. Great. Any more we can put you down for? Testimony introduced in the trial pretty much put the nail on the coffin for Fritz and the 17th victim, though he appears to have forgotten the victim's face and personality. Fritz seemed a bit more nervous than normal, court even adjourning for 30 minutes so he could go smoke a cigar and chill a bit. December 16th. The trial is finally getting to Fritz a little. Where most wish for lovely presents and gifts at Christmas, he's hoping for a speedy execution. With an unlit cigarette in his mouth because he's not allowed to smoke in court, quote, then I won't go on with the trial. If I can't smoke, I can't think. I've had enough, end quote. He longs to be dead before Christmas. December 17th. 2 alienists said Fritz was sane. You sure? Professor Schultz, quote, it is wrong to conclude that such a criminal must be insane, even though most bestial of deeds can be committed by a sane person, end quote. The other alienist, Dr. Schackwitz, said, quote, Harrmann was not insane when he committed murder, nor is he insane now. Harrmann, however, is a man of considerable moral inferiority. He is intellectually weak and has feminine traits and a hysterical character. All of these, however, would not prevent a free exercise of his will. There is a strong indication that he killed through impulse at times, and at other times merely to get the clothes of his victims, end quote. Professor Schultz would continue, nor was Harrmann in an alcoholic twilight condition. But even if he were, this would be an excuse only for the first few murders. When I talked with him, he said, if I hadn't killed all those people, I wouldn't be so famous as I am now. I have beaten all murder records. Harrmann told me he wanted the executioner's knife made very sharp. He said to me, quote, I will surely go to heaven and my mother will plead there for me, end quote. He considers, continued Schultz, that he has had a wonderful life and wants to put it in a novel. He promised me 1/2 of the profits of the sale of the book, the other half to go to Hans Granz, his alleged accomplice. He specified, though, that Granz must put a wreath on his grave on his birthday every year, end quote. Tickets to the trial are sold outside of the courthouse at $5 each. Sure, before Christmas nowadays, people are going to see the Trans-Siberian Orchestra, ballet performances of the Nutcracker. Murder trial fits right in. December 18th. When asked if Fritz had any final words before the case goes to the jury, he said, quote, make it short, end quote. Prosecution also asked for the death penalty for Granz as the alleged instigator of 2 of the victims. December 19th. Fritz has been sentenced to death today, basically 24 times, found guilty of murdering 24 young men over a 6-year period. Grans was sentenced to death also, but for inciting murder in only one case, and it sounds like he will have to serve 12 years for complicity first. Fritz said, quote, "I go to the decapitating block joyfully and happily. Don't send me to the insane asylum. I would rather not live," end quote. To the jury, he said, quote, "Were I set at liberty, I would murder again. Why I kill is a mystery to me. In Grans' hands, I was soft as wax, but I needed him, as I was alone in the world. How I got into this condition, I don't know. I simply saw that in the morning there was a corpse next to me, but not in all cases. I never acted with premeditation, and I don't understand why my victims did not offer resistance," end quote. Apparently, he would like to be beheaded in a public square with lots of people and have the beheading filmed, as you do, maybe with a taco truck. December 22nd, 1924. Quote, "If my head is cut off in the public market, many people will come and look on. The whole thing will be filmed and shown all over the world. Then the world will talk about me," end quote. Then he added with visible pride, quote, "In murdering, I certainly beat all world records," end quote. Did Guinness exist back then? Before he dies, he wants a strong cup of coffee, some tobacco, and a good piece of cheese. After he's dead, he wants a monument in his honor. Quote, "Here rests the wholesale murderer, Harmon," end quote. Again, he wants Grans to put a wreath on his grave, or perhaps on the monument, for his birthday every year because he believes that Grans will escape the death penalty. February 10th, 1925. Fritz is trying to save Grans, secretly writing a long letter which dropped all charges against Grans. Hans is refusing a pardon. Quote, "No, I want justice. I am innocent and Harmon knows it," end quote. Fritz's letter continues, quote, "Hans Grans for years cheated me, lied to me, and exploited me, but in spite of it all, I couldn't leave him. The police forced me by blows and terrible mistreatment to drag in Grans. Thus I was forced to make false charges from fear. I lied just to get from the police. The police told me Grans was telling on me and that I might as well tell on him. They were determined to convict us both. The more I lied about Grans, the more decent the police treatment of me became. I solemnly swear that Grans did not know anything whatever of my previous life. He did not know I murdered. He never saw anything. I call heaven to witness that Grans was innocently condemned," end quote. February 25th. Professor R. Herverts of Bern University is analyzing some brain matter. I mean, not literally, but one of the reasons I've long had such an interest in true crime is the psychology behind a murderer. Professor Herverts said, quote, "For years and years during the war and after, the Germans passed through an unheard of ordeal of privations, exposing their bodies to hunger, disease, and starvation. Likewise, their souls have been trampled upon and tortured by hopes that were shattered, and by promises that were never fulfilled. This is what caused a general hysteria, which to my mind is the only explanation that may be offered for the unspeakable crimes of vampires like Harmon and Denke, which set Germany aghast and made the civilized world shudder with disgust and abhorrence. All experts agree that crimes, being psychological phenomena, can be traced back to psychological motives or causes and explained in accordance with the causal proposition, just like any other material happenings. There are two groups of motives that may serve to explain actions. One is based on the psychosis of the individual, the other on the psychosis of the individual's surroundings, for every human being is a product of both components. Individually speaking, Harmon and Denke are typical cases of psychoneurosis, or hysteria. Not being armed with normal weapons for the struggle of life, they feel, unconsciously, inadequate to the demands of normal life, or, in other words, they are fully conscious of their intellectual and moral inferiority. Their defenselessness results in introversion, and this lack of touch with their normal surroundings in its turn results in abnormal actions. April 13th. Victim families want more detailed information about the fate of their children, plus the lengthy confession Fritz was alleged to have made to the jail's warden. I don't see that either of these wishes were fulfilled. April 15th. Quote, "I am guilty, gentlemen, but hard though it may be, I want to die as a man," end quote. And with that, he was guillotined, his head severed from his body. German law dictates that 12 highly respected citizens serve as witnesses, dressed in high silk hats and black Prince Albert-style coats. The guillotine was not in the public square like Fritz wanted, but in a secluded spot of the prison grounds, next to an altar with a cross. The sentence was read along with the court's opinion before the attending judges in their robes, who then confirmed the sentence. Fritz, wearing a gray uniform, was brought in from his cell and faced the judges and witnesses, shifting his weight nervously. The curtain hiding the guillotine was withdrawn, and this seemed to be when he realized what was really about to happen. But then he acknowledged his guilt, said a few things, and that was all she wrote. The executioner, one of only 2 in Germany, pronounced him deceased. The witnesses and judges removed their hats, and the clergy said a prayer. Apparently at this time, Hanover is the only city in Prussia where the guillotine has replaced the headman's axe. So what happened to Hans? January 19th, 1926. Granz's death sentence was commuted to only 12 years. He would not get his head chopped off after all. Now, the term serial killer wasn't in existence yet, but Fritz certainly was one, reminding me a little bit of Jeffrey Dahmer or John Wayne Gacy, who sought out boys and young men who were looking for work, perhaps having run away from home and were living on the streets, or traveling around to see if there was a place worthwhile to live to get some good pay, or unfortunately, perhaps they were doing sex work. Though not mentioned specifically in the papers, I would read just in doing some internet research that many of these young boys and men were also sexually assaulted. And was Hans really innocent? The 2 of them lived together, were said outside of the newspapers to be having some kind of relationship. Hans would get the clothes and other items from the boys and young men and would pawn them off. There was all kinds of horrible things laying around in that small apartment. It had to be obvious what was happening. But perhaps Hans really didn't do any of the actual murdering. Still, although anyone directly involved with this is long deceased, may his victims and their families rest in peace.